Welcome back to my channel. Today I will tell you the story of a seemingly exemplary father and husband, Robert Spangler. April 11, 1993. Just before noon at the Grand Canyon Park office, an upset man reports an accident. He reports that he and his wife had been hiking through the canyon's rocks for 4 days, and when today they reached the Horseshoe Canyon formation to rest there, he wanted to take some pictures. He was setting up his tripod, his back turned, and suddenly heard a sound and looked over. His wife was gone. He tells how he immediately started looking for her, running around in a panic. He finally spotted her. She had fallen, he estimated, about 45 meters down. So he carefully descended the rocks, and when he finally reached her, he immediately noticed that she was dead, even though at least at first glance she had no wounds except for a few scratches on her face. The man's name is Robert Spangler, and his wife's name is Donna Spangler. The guards immediately go to the scene of the accident, and the police are also called. Robert must recount the course of the day and give all the circumstances of the accident. His statement is noted in great detail. Giving it, Robert is completely broken down and crying. He speaks of his wife with tenderness, and his testimony gives the impression of being very sincere. Officers of the sheriff's office, in accordance with procedure, launch an investigation. Apart from Robert himself, there are no other witnesses, but nothing in what happened arouses the suspicions of the police. Donna apparently lost her balance in some unsecured place and fell. The local doctor issues a death certificate with a note that Donna's death was an accident. The investigation is dropped. A year passes, summer arrives. One day, investigator Bruce Cornish of the Coconino County Police receives a phone call. A person from Donna's circle of friends calls and informs him of suspicions about her death and the fact that Nancy, Robert's first wife, died under unexplained circumstances. The investigator takes this tip very seriously. He finds materials on the incident and indeed comes across a strange case. December 30, 1978, Littleton, Colorado. This is where Robert and Nancy Spangler live with their 2 children, Susan, 15, and David, 17. Before noon, Susan's boyfriend arrives at her house. He had called her earlier, but no one answered. No one answers the door, so the boyfriend walks up to the house and throws stones at Susan's window, as he always does. Since Susan doesn't respond, the boy goes around the house. He gets inside through an ajar window in the utility room. He goes upstairs to Susan's room. He sees her lying on the bed, so to wake her up, he throws his gloves at her, shouting, "Sue, wake up!" The girl does not move. It begins to occur to the boy that she is dead. He turns and runs to her brother's room. David is lying partially on the bed, and there is blood on the floor next to him. The terrified boy calls the police. It is 12:30 at noon. The protocol states what investigators found at the scene. A young woman with a gunshot wound was lying face down on a bed. In the hallway lay her brother, partly on the bed, partly on the floor, his face in a pillow. He died from a gunshot wound to the chest. On the first floor, police officers find Nancy's body literally impaled on the chair she was sitting on. The chair stands next to a desk, and on the desk is a typewriter. A sheet is stuck in the typewriter. It is a writing signed with only one letter, N. It looks like a farewell letter. From its contents, one can conclude that Nancy shot both children while they were sleeping. 5 hours later, Robert returns home. Giving an explanation, he says that there were problems in his marriage and that there had been an argument between him and his wife the evening before, which continued in the morning. Robert adds that it was for this reason that he told his wife in the morning that he wanted to move out. His testimony indicates that Nancy, heartbroken by the prospect of separating from her husband, decided to kill herself and her family. Despite some ambiguities, investigators favor this version. Soon the forensic doctor also confirms it. Nancy shot herself, having shot her children first. In light of those events of years ago, however, Donna's current accident looks different. Bruce Cornish of the Coconino Police comes to the following conclusion. If Robert killed his family years ago, he was able to murder Donna as well. Bruce Cornish contacts Littleton police officers. After receiving this information, Paul Goodman, the Littleton investigator, decides to reopen the 1978 case. The officers study the files again and examine all the evidence found at the crime scene. They start with a typewriter and a letter. Police officers point out that there were no fingerprints on the letter sheet. These were only found on the typewriter, while someone had tried to remove something from certain areas of the machine. Another issue is the location of the revolver from which Nancy allegedly fired a shot at herself. The police officers review the file again and conclude that the shot to Nancy's head looks as if it was fired from too far away, from a distance from which a suicide would not have been able to do so, or from a distance from which suicides usually do not fire shots. For this reason, investigators now believe that the forensic doctor who issued the death certificate at the time and declared Nancy's death a suicide apparently missed something. In order to dispel these doubts, they are turning to a gunshot wound specialist and asking him to check all available data. The appointed expert concludes that the bullet hit Nancy directly in the skull. However, the photos show that there were tiny dots around the gunshot hole, which looked like small scratches, arranged in a specific pattern. This pattern around the wound is the first sign to a specialist that something is wrong here, because after a shot is fired, not only the bullet comes out of the weapon, but also, for example, particles of unburned gunpowder. Such gunpowder leaves characteristic marks on the skin, while the marks on Nancy's skin show that the shot in the forehead was fired from a distance of 15 to 25 centimeters. This is too great a distance, and the suicide version should be ruled out, if only because from the point of view of the suicide it would be too likely that the bullet would miss its target. Typical of suicides are contact gunshot wounds, in which the barrel's exit comes into direct contact with the skin. The expert concludes that in this case the shot must have been fired by another person. Nancy was therefore murdered. Robert becomes the prime suspect. Littleton investigators decide to reopen the case of his family's death, but aren't sure they have enough evidence in hand to prosecute him for the murder of his family. And indeed, almost as soon as the investigation is reopened, it begins to look like it will come to a standstill again. So the police decide to look into Donna's death, hoping that perhaps something will be found that will make it possible to charge Robert with her murder. Unfortunately, there are few leads in the case, and no witness statements. It is clear that if the suspect does not confess, it will be difficult to prove that he murdered his wife. At the same time, it is highly unlikely that a person like Robert, someone who has been able to commit several murders and has gone unpunished for years, will confess to the crime. The FBI turns to skilled profilers for help. At their direction, the FBI begins discreetly questioning Robert's family and friends to gather as much detailed information about him as possible, especially information that would say something about his personality. The police and FBI consider creating a strategy that would lead Robert to confess to his crimes. It is now 1999 and Robert is being watched all the time. At the time, he lives in Grand Junction, Colorado, has a fourth wife and works as an actor in the theater. When during one of the rehearsals he suddenly can't remember the text, he goes to see a doctor. It turns out that Robert has terminal brain cancer. He informs his family and friends of this diagnosis and the fact that he only has about a year left to live. One of the people he knows passes this information on to the Littleton police. Littleton investigators realize that it is necessary to get Robert to talk as quickly as possible. At the same time, they hope that the man, faced with death, will decide to confess to his crimes. A race against time begins. The investigators decide to go to Grand Junction and proceed there, joining forces with the local police. They plan to start by interrogating Robert. On September 14, 2000, the first interview with Robert takes place. The interrogators ask him if he would like, especially now, in the face of imminent death, to shed his burden. Unfortunately, they fail to extract any specific confessions from the suspect. However, when they say at the end that they would still like to talk to him, Robert replies, "I know." And the next morning he calls and offers to talk. It's hard to say what's driving him. Perhaps it's a desire to remain in the spotlight, or perhaps the realization that he doesn't have that much left to lose. During this second meeting, the investigators put into practice a strategy developed earlier, the point of which boils down to appealing to Robert as a person eager for recognition and fame, and thus persuade him to testify. The appearance of the police station was arranged to exaggerate the size of the investigation. The sheriff's office looked as if it was being handled by dozens of people. Robert's name was on the board, and several people sat in the room at phones and computers. Interrogators informed Robert that his testimony will be of great scientific value. The profilers would like to examine him, as they could learn a lot from him. The agent also says that although he has dealt with killers, but never with someone so creative, so if Robert would be willing to talk about his crimes, he would become an extremely interesting object of research. The interrogators emphasize that it's all about serial killers. The profilers want to learn more about them, and so Robert could tell about his actions. After all, he has several victims to his credit. The strategy proves extremely successful. After a 4-hour interrogation, Robert confesses to the murder of his first wife and 2 of his children. In an emotionless voice, he describes in detail the crime from years ago. He begins by saying that he had planned it before, so he once got Nancy to tap out the letter N on a blank piece of paper, on which he then wrote a suicide letter. On the day of the crime, he told his wife that he had a surprise for her for Christmas, and thus persuaded her to go downstairs to the basement. There he asked, "Come here, sit down and close your eyes." And when she did, he pulled out a gun and shot her in the head. Robert recounts that he then went upstairs to his daughter's room. Susan was asleep. "I shot her in the heart, from what I remember. The doctor's report agrees exactly," Robert tells interrogators. He then went to his son's room. The son was awake, apparently awakened by the sound of an earlier shot. Robert shot his son, standing in the doorway. The boy slumped, but was still alive. Robert decided that if the crime was to be attributed to Nancy, he could not shoot a second time, so he smothered his son with a pillow. In recounting this, Robert shows no emotion, is cool and very matter-of-fact. He is equally calm and matter-of-fact when he explains to investigators why he murdered his entire family. "I decided then that this would somehow be easier for me than divorce. And I'll say it again, at the time I just thought it was a good idea," he states. This testimony provides an explanation for the 1978 murder, but when police ask about Donna's death, Robert insists that it was merely an accident. The officers know that Robert craves fame and recognition and that he is fascinated by the vision of being recognized as a famous serial killer. They decide to strike at that very point, that is, to exploit his mania for greatness. The FBI agent addresses Robert with the following words: "You're not a serial killer, since you've only killed once and you've only told us about one murder you committed, which was 16 years ago." This trick turns out to be a hit. Since Robert absolutely wants to pass himself off as a serial killer and gain the respect of profilers, he confesses to Donna's murder. "It was a spontaneous decision. Donna was not of heavy posture, so it was not difficult," Robert reports. He says he simply stretched out both hands in front of him and pushed his wife into the abyss. His motivation was similar to that of his first wife. Such a solution was simpler than divorce. Robert gives extensive testimony on this subject. He shows not the slightest remorse or regret. He is even proud that for so many years no one has come across his trail, despite having committed so many murders. During the interrogation, he talks about himself with apparent fascination. "I would like to find out what made me acquire such an act. I think that most people, and here I am absolutely sure, would not be able to do it. I am different. I am interesting. You, for example, are an ordinary man," he says, looking at the FBI agent. Information about the whole affair is getting into the media. In Grand Junction, where Robert last lived and knew a lot of people, the news spreads with lightning speed. People who knew him are shocked, as they thought Robert was a nice, quiet man. The whole town talks about nothing else for months. Robert is taken into custody. Since he confessed to all the crimes, there is no need for a jury. During the trial, at which there are crowds of people, Robert behaves as if he were on stage. He smiles and winks at his friends. He is found guilty of 4 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Investigators stress that the verdict was of great importance to Nancy's relatives, as they gained certainty that she was not the perpetrator of her children's deaths. After 22 years, Nancy's family could therefore breathe a sigh of relief. In August 2001, More than 20 years after the murder of his family, and 8 years after the murder of his wife Donna, Robert Spangler died of cancer in prison. He was 68 years old at the time of his death. And that is the end of this story. Thank you for listening, and until next time, take care of yourself and goodbye.